Okay, so the purpose of today's talk is to go over device changes or planned changes and the regulatory implications associated with that and how you use the FDA guidance documents to help you make those decisions. So the two main guidance documents that we're going to be talking about are deciding when to submit a 510(k) change for a change to an existing device, and that's comprehensive of hardware and software devices. And then for devices that do have software or that are SAMD, there's another guidance document that applies that's deciding when to submit a 510(k) for a software change to an existing device. So if you have software, both of them apply in all circumstances. And if you don't have software, of course, only the general one applies. But today we're going to talk about the two main uses of those guidance documents. And the first of which is probably what most people think of, and that's a post-market evaluation for your letter to file, as you call it. So that's your change control documentation to show that you went through the FDA guidance evaluation process to determine whether or not a new 510(k) is required based on the changes you're making after you have clearance when your product's already in the market. So that's kind of the original intended scope of the guidance documents. And that's what's expected to be documented when you make changes. And some people aren't really sure what a letter to file actually is. Is that something you send to the FDA or what is it? But it's actually just a letter to the design history file is the file that we're referencing there. And so this is an internal documentation of the process you've gone through for the change evaluation. So this isn't something you send to the FDA. This is just something that typically goes with your change record within your internal quality system. So another way that we're going to talk about how to use these guidance documents is for pre-market strategy. So you can proactively evaluate anticipated design changes, like if a company is exploring a device with many different possible functionalities that they see rolling out over many different releases over time, then you can map out your timeline and evaluate which of those changes along the way would trigger a new 510(k) and just map out what to expect there as far as the broader regulatory strategy for your device. Another way that you can use it to strategize is if you have all of these features and you want to implement as many as you possibly can before your original pre-market submission, then you can evaluate the different changes that you have on your to-do list and determine which of those would definitely trigger a new submission and which of those would I be able to add down the road as a letter to file. And in those cases, you can likely prioritize the ones that would trigger a new review and maybe put off some of the ones that would not. So that's just something that we encounter often is clients have this feature that you want to have as part of your software, but your development activities surrounding implementing that feature are significant to the point where it might delay the submission. Well, using this tool as a strategic tool, you might decide to put off that development implementation to submit your 510(k) sooner. So we're going to be kind of digging into both of those approaches through the course of this. So the key principles behind both of the guidance documents is mostly going to be a risk-based evaluation, looking at the impact of the changes and how it is impacting the functionality and safety of the device. So the first key principle is the intent to significantly affect the safety or effectiveness. So when evaluating and documenting your changes, look at what the purpose of that change is. Are you changing the functionality? Are you significantly improving it? And if that is the intention behind why you're changing it, then it may trigger a new 510(k). So with that, you certainly want to do a risk-based assessment for the changes regardless of what the change is, because even if it's not intended to have a significant impact on the safety or effectiveness, it could still have a significant enough impact to the safety or performance or to other aspects of the software or to the device that would still trigger a new 510(k). So manufacturers should conduct a thorough risk-based assessment using the FDA guidelines to evaluate the change. And the two guidance documents both provide a lot of guidance as to what's expected for that risk assessment. And a good practice for this is to take your risk analysis and identify which of the risks that are identified in your risk analysis apply to the change that you're making, or which of those risks could be impacted by the changes you're making, and reference those risk IDs and reference that evaluation and assessment that you're making for basing that decision. And then also, if there are new risks, or if you are significantly changing the risk profile of the device, or making a change to the functionality, then regardless of whether or not it's a 510K or a letter to file, you still need to do the necessary V&V activities associated with evaluating that change. So that's typically a really important part of the letters to file, is that you have adequately tested the change to ensure that it's meeting your requirements and not introducing new risks that weren't anticipated. And then lastly, another principle that the guidance is focused on is a comparative analysis. So this is comparing the change or the collective changes over time to the cleared version of the device. So the guidance gets into more specifics as far as like evaluating cumulative changes, but you maybe have heard of the term of like a catch-up 510K, and that's where individually all of these different changes may not in and of themselves trigger a new regulatory submission, but cumulatively, if you're making enough of these changes, then you need to at a point consider if it's deviated far enough from the original cleared device to where it would warrant a new submission to catch up the FDA's file on the device. So oftentimes this is something companies can do proactively, but other times this is something that when the FDA comes to inspect you and they're looking through your design history file and looking at your letters to file and your change notes, they might say, okay, you've made a lot of letters to file. You're kind of getting pretty far. We would recommend you do a catch-up 510K. So not necessarily the core focus of these guidances, but just something to be aware of if you are planning on making a lot of small changes to your device. So we already kind of touched on this, but basically how to use the guidance documents and what the FDA expects to see from a compliance perspective for your post-market change evaluation is identifying the purpose and impact of the change, conducting the risk-based assessment, and I'm going to show you here in a minute all of the different flowcharts that are in the guidance, but the FDA provides flowcharts that have a step-by-step evaluation for the thought process behind evaluating the changes. And at every single decision point in the flowchart, you should document your rationale behind the decisions you're making that's driving you towards a letter to file or driving you towards a new regulatory submission. So the documentation of those activities is the letter to file. From a pre-market strategy perspective, of course, this is not something that is like an active change to a marketed device. So the FDA is not as concerned with your documentation proactively, but it's still a great exercise to go through the processes that you would post-market by identifying the purpose of the change, conducting the same risk assessment, because all of these things are necessary in order to really ensure and to really document that you've adequately evaluated the changes, applying the flowcharts, doing the step-by-step evaluation, and making a proactive determination as to whether or not the change would in the future require a new 510K. Once you've been able to kind of determine that based off of the changes you anticipate or would like to make, then you may consider triaging the development activity to prioritize the implementation of the changes that would maybe trigger a new 510K over the ones that could maybe be added as a letter to file. So, the post-market change control records are required once you're marketing your device, but for a pre-market strategy, it's also good as part of your regulatory strategy documentation to document the same types of evaluation. So you might have heard of a PCCP or might be wondering, like, how does this relate to a PCCP, which is a predetermined change control plan for medical devices? So PCCP is a plan that you can submit as part of your regulatory submission, which essentially pre-clears you to make changes after you get clearance. So the main difference between like a PCCP or the need to have a PCCP and just making regular changes that you would document as a letter to file comes down to the flow charts and down to the decision as to whether or not a new 510K is going to be required. If you're looking at this proactively and evaluating a feature and going through the flow charts and it leads you to documentation only, that would not be the subject of a PCCP. That would not need to be something that you would include in a PCCP. The FDA wouldn't allow you to submit a PCCP for something that would otherwise be just documentation letter to file. If you're doing your proactive evaluation and the decision tree leads you to a new 510K is required, those are the features or functions that you could consider including as a PCCP or in a PCCP. So similar to how we talked about evaluating whether the development activities should be prioritized based on what will require a new 510K. If you have anything that would trigger a 510K that you know you're not going to be able to implement in time, then maybe that would be something you would bucket into a category of maybe this would be a good opportunity for a PCCP. So there's kind of three buckets that your plan changes or your plan features could fall into, and following the FDA guidance for evaluating the changes and referencing this PCCP guidance will help you make a decision and strategize what's the best route to take for planning out your development activities in alignment with your timeline goals and your marketing goals. So that's kind of an overview of the change control process and guidances at a high level. I also wanted to kind of dig in a little bit deeper to some of the flow charts and just show you what those decision trees look like so that you can be aware of the types of questions you should be asking yourself when you're faced with a question about, do we implement this now? Do we implement this later? Or what's the severity of this change from a regulatory perspective? So the FDA, like I said, has these great flow charts, and these are the ones that you'll go through in documenting your letter to file. But what I would say is don't just look at the flow charts. For every single decision point that they have here, there's a greater description and a long paragraph or two on how to answer this question or the important things you need to consider when answering this question. So if you're going through any of the flow charts to make your decision and you're not really sure how to answer it, I would definitely point you back to the content and the paragraphs that are found in the guidance to give you a better idea. And the other thing I would point out, in addition to the flow charts, is at the bottom of all of these guidances, there's dozens of examples. And so you can skim through those examples and see if there's one that is similar to the change that you're considering. And the examples detail the change and then detail the decision. And that can be really helpful. Sometimes you'll find that there's a perfect example that represents the change you're considering. So just wanted to kind of frame the guidance for you so that you would know to go beyond the flow charts, even though these are where you're going to be basing your decision documentation. So the first is from the general guidance, and it is a main flow chart that is just pointing you to the other relevant flow charts for label changes, technology or performance changes, and material changes. So those are the three main categories in the original guidance. And then software is an entirely separate guidance document that does not necessarily flow from these flow charts, but is referenced and is applicable. So we don't necessarily have to get into the weeds of all of these, but I just wanted to kind of show you an example. So, and I apologize, I know this is very small, but the way it is written on the left is the way that I would typically document this in a letter to file, is I basically write out the decision tree in text and then would answer it and provide the justification or the rationale for each decision point within the letter to file. But specifically for labeling, this doesn't just relate to, what is the software label or what is the physical label on your product. This relates to your indications for use and changes to how you want to, and changes to your marketing claims and how you want to describe your product. So if any changes you're making would change your intended use or your indications for use, or would add a function to your intended use or your indications for use, then this would certainly be a flowchart you would need to visit. So if you are working on a software device and you think that, oh, I'm just going to follow the software guidance, you may be missing really key change evaluations that you need to be considering. So make sure that your documentation process always captures the documentation with both guidance documents. So, so for labeling, important things to note here are if you're going from prescription use to over-the-counter, like if this is normally in a doctor's office and now it's going to be used at home, those would be kind of automatic triggers that's a major change. That's going to require a new 510K. Is this device going from single use to being reusable? That has a lot of implications as far as, reprocessing, cleanliness, re-sterilization, lots of new risks. That would require a new 510K. If you're making any changes to your indications, that's just intended to clarify how it's used or to, stay within the same intent, but modifying it for clarity, then there's some flexibility there. But of course, if you're adding like new functions or new features or expanding your indications or making them more specific indications, like for a specific disease or something, lots of those things would trigger a new 510K. So certainly an important one that oftentimes would trigger a new 510K. The next flowchart is for technology and performance. So this also relates to software that may not always be captured by the software guidance, because it relates to the operating principles of the system and the core technological characteristics of how your device is achieving its intended use. So again, some of these questions aren't going to be applicable. Those are easy to skip over, but there will be some, like B2 is an important one that oftentimes would trigger a new 510K. And also methods and protocols used to validate the changes is something that is going to be reviewed as part of this flowchart as well. So I'm going to just be going pretty fast through this because really just a high level overview of going through it isn't going to really help much. What you really need to do is work through the flowcharts for your particular change and dig into the paragraphs and the details of the guidance to help make these decisions and document these decisions. But just kind of wanted to outline that for you. Materials, this is pretty self-explanatory, won't be applicable for software changes. And then this is the flowchart from the software change guidance specifically. So this is separate from all the other flowcharts. And this starts with evaluating whether it's just intended to be a change for cybersecurity. If that is the only reason motivating the change and the only impact of the change, then it does not require a new 510K. If the change is being made solely to return the system into specification of the more recently cleared device, that also doesn't require a change. If you're just reverting back to the original cleared software, that doesn't require a 510K. And then you get into the deeper questions as far as if the change is introducing a new risk or modifying a risk that could result in significant harm that is not effectively mitigated in the most recently cleared device. So this is important to note the word significant harm, because sometimes you will have changes that add a risk controller, change things that are modifying your risk assessment. But as long as it's not significant, as long as it's not relating to something that will lead to significant harm, then you can justify why documentation is sufficient. But this is also why it's really important to trace to your actual risk management documentation, where you're evaluating the severity of the risks, Because if you're able to link to those risks and it shows that those are all, you know, a lower severity, then that's how you can justify why it doesn't require. That's like a complete paper trail that shows that you have justification to why and how you're answering this decision point. And then next is, could the change significantly affect the clinical functionality or performance specifications directly associated with the intended use of the device? So that is a really important one that that is something that relates to the PCCPs, and as far as like algorithm changes, and are you significantly affecting the clinical functionality, and being able to, you know, define what that means within the context of your device and its intended use. Oftentimes, if the change that you're making requires clinical data or requires a new clinical study, oftentimes that will require a new 510K. So that's kind of a good rule of thumb if you're trying to evaluate bigger changes that you think fit within your intended use. But if it's going to require new clinical data, then that might be something that triggers a 510K. So beyond that, there's additional considerations that the FDA is not quite as prescriptive about, but they outline additional factors that can influence the decision to file. And these are a little bit more subjective to, you know, the company's assessment of the impact of these changes. That relates to infrastructure changes, architecture changes, core algorithm changes that do or don't directly contribute to the intended use, clarification of requirements, any cosmetic changes or user interface changes, and any re-engineering or refactoring. So you have to document whether or not any of these apply and evaluate the impact of these as well, as part of your letter to file for software changes. So that was just kind of the high level overview to make sure that everybody was aware of the guidance documents and how to use them and how to base your decisions on them. So I guess with that, we can, that's the end of the slides. We can jump into some specific examples if we wanted to. So Reese, did you want to speak in general terms about the topic that you had at hand?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Mary. This is really great. I feel like it's been helpful to kind of walk through the flow charts. I did this a long time ago and have forgotten almost all of the details, so it's a very good refresher. So the example that I ran into recently is with a client who is building a tool that includes a DICOM viewer. So they want to perform measurements on findings for CT and MR. And they're considering expanding their use case to include measurements on PET CT fusion. The specific reason for that is because it enables certain clinical assessments that currently they still do in the device, but you have to manually specify the information that normally would be automatically measured from PET CT. So there's two decisions that the client has to make. One is, or rather two features they need to implement. One is they want to replace the foundational technologies of the DICOM viewer itself. So currently it's written in one library and we need to effectively re-implement it using a different foundational technology to support the rendering of PET CT fusion. So that is the first motivation, is we need to make a technological change, but that could be implemented without turning on support for PET. So that would really be like replacing a chunk of the software with no user-facing impact. And then the second decision point is actually turning on support for PET CT and supporting the measurement of standard uptake values as an input to the response criteria. So those kind of two decisions, trying to figure out when to stage those features and when to implement them is becoming a key decision point.
Yeah, so I guess I'll open the floor to everybody else. Does anybody have any thoughts or gut reactions as to what they think?
Sure.
Yeah.
So based upon my experience, I usually tell clients that you're allowed to make under the hood adjustments using the guidance documents as Mary explained. but a lot of times the threshold is when you add a feature. And what I mean by adding a feature is something that doesn't exist, and maybe in the GUI you'll start seeing it. And I speak from two experiences. One where I had a client add a feature, did a letter to the file, and then we submitted a 510K several years later. An FDA reviewer asked us, "Oh, we don't recall reviewing this feature." And let's just say it was a very tense 2 weeks as we were supplying information. It turned into be a catch-up 510K, but it could have ended not in a good way. So the notion that you're never going to have to submit again to the FDA a 510K is unrealistic. And so that would be one example of how, yeah, it might get you through this situation, but you may regret it later. The second situation is your competitors, or, people are submitting new 510Ks. They might make their comparison shot, and they'll say, "Oh, our predicate has this feature." And when they submitted to the FDA looked at it, and once again, we don't recall clearing that, and that could trigger, a problem. And finally, there's one company, I'm not going to name any names, but I'm not exactly sure how the FDA found out about it, but they were forced to recall their product. It was software as a medical device, and it's because they made a feature, and that sent a message to everybody. So those are just, and the other thing too is some of the more advanced companies will have procedures on how they, what are the thresholds for letters of file, and they might say when we go from version 2 to version 3, those are special 510Ks. When we're making a change from 3.1 to 3.2, if it fits into the guidance documents that Mary mentioned, then those take over. So that's all I have to say about that, Mike. Does that help you out?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very helpful to know. And that I hadn't thought about that idea of another company using your device as a predicate, and that being a trigger for the FDA recognizing, wait a minute, I don't recall that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so I think, George, you touched on a lot of important things, and the one of which is when you're implementing a new feature, and it sounds like this is, a new underlying technology, a new function that the software is going to be performing, which, and this is just an example, a template of a letter to file, where you can document the evaluation of these changes. So just background information, description, the change, reason for the change, risk management, and then getting into the flowchart evaluation. So just looking at the first of these, I think the first question, it would somewhat depend on how the indications for use are written, and if they specify the imaging modalities that are covered by the system. So if you're adding new imaging modalities to specific indications that include other imaging modalities, then that would possibly trigger this flowchart that would have some implications. If it is not written specifically in the indications, then the answers to these might be no, and the labeling flowchart might not lead you to a new 510K. But then, of course, you'd go down to the technology, engineering, and performance changes, and I would suggest that possibly this is a new operating principle if it is taking a new imaging modality and applying a new analysis method to determine a new output. I would think that this decision point would maybe stop me, and I would have to think about how to justify this if I think it's not novel operating principle relative to what's already been done. So, any thoughts on this, how you would consider it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in this particular context, thinking about I'm not sure if the intended use of this device was specific about the kinds of measurements that were being performed. I think that was left a little nebulous. I think they might have not mentioned anything other than quantitative measurements of some kind. And so in that sense, it's like, well, would adding this, standard uptake value, would that qualify as a new operating principle, or is it kind of an extension of what was already listed? I feel like if you're doing that, you're getting a little bit into the weeds though, and you probably could argue it either way.
Yeah.
And so, it makes sense that, yeah.
That's where this gets tricky, because sometimes it does come down to how could you justify it? And, oftentimes companies are able to justify why the answer is no to these, why it is a letter to file. And you just have to be confident and be able to then defend yourself when the FDA comes to inspects you and argues the other side. But it's certainly like a risk-based decision, a regulatory risk that companies can choose to make. If they feel like there is a strong argument for a letter to file, then that's a choice that some companies can make. And of course, the risk, if you're wrong, is that the FDA, when they come to inspect you, or when they become aware through other ways of these changes, if they end up disagreeing with you, then best case scenario is they would tell you to submit a 510K, but would not require you to stop marketing your product. But worst case scenario would be they would say you need to remove that functionality, or you need to stop marketing your product until you receive clearance for those functions that we're arguing about. Luckily, in the case of software as a medical device, it's a lot easier most times for companies to call back their software and revert it to an offering that doesn't include the problematic function. So for software companies, maybe that is a pretty low regulatory risk to take that chance. So definitely gets tricky when you could argue something both ways, but that's where the risk-based decision and the business risks that the company's willing to take kind of might drive some of that. George, did you listen?
I think also when you're faced with these types of situations, sometimes you get cornered and taken by surprise, and the client might want you to make the decision. And some of the arguments that I see, the ends justify the means. We can't afford another 510K. We have to get this out right away. And so I always look at it that you have to help the client reach the right decision. So first of all, with the FDA, cost does not come in, supersede safety. So even though something may be safe, the FDA oftentimes is the arbitrator outside of the risk analysis. The other thing too is that to help a client make the decision, I always tell them the next person that's going to read your letter to file, okay, is going to be either an FDA inspector, which is different from the FDA that reviews 510Ks. The people that have FDA that review 510Ks, they all have PhDs. They're, scientific type people. The investigator is a compliance person. And so that person is going to be looking at it differently, and they're going to challenge you, him or her. And usually 510Ks that you make a modification, if you're doing it because of a complaint, then they're going to look at it, is it in your CAPA system? And, did you capture it as a complaint? So you sometimes when a letter file is being proposed, you have to get all the facts. And sometimes it might be, we can't afford to submit to the FDA. And if they're going to live with that decision, you might have to explain the circumstances. In other words, next person to read this, it's going to be an FDA inspector, or it could also be the person buying your company. A lot of times the regulatory professionals have a lot of influence on those types of decisions. And it's not that they won't buy your company, but they could use that as a negotiating tool saying, oh, they took some risk here, so we're going to have to do that catch-up 510K that Mary mentioned. And then the other person that could read your file is a product liability lawyer. In the case where you thought it wasn't a problem and it is a problem, or, something unrelated to your product that they're going to use it against you that you guys didn't let the FDA know about it.
Yeah.
But I'm not discouraging letters to file, because oftentimes you'll find a situation where the regulatory people in a company will be the most conservative ones because they have to defend it. And so you have some regulatory professionals, I'll say it's always a filing to the FDA, when you look at, the facts and you'll say, no, this is a letter to file. It's under the hood. It's not a feature. So those are just some of the things I've run into.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, that it might not just be the FDA who ends up needing to review these files. It might be other stakeholders as well. So keep that in mind also. I just wanted to jump down to the software changes, flowchart and decision tree, and see if there's anything else that would be triggered by the change that we're discussing. So I think the topic of new risks might arise if you're providing a new piece of clinical information. The FDA is going to be interested in, like, what is that used for? And so sometimes for devices that have like general indications, general measurement indications, you don't have to get into the clinical specifics of how that information is used, but you might need to consider that when it comes from a risk-based perspective in your letter to file, if you're adding a new functionality that could be used for possibly a higher risk intended use than what was originally a function of the device. So that would also be one that I would want to be very confident on, or that I could anticipate some two sides to that conversation. And then the last question on the flowchart is, does it affect the clinical functionality or performance specifications? So yeah, those are all kind of probably the questions I would focus on and need to dig deeper on and do thorough risk assessment on to make sure that that I can confidently defend those if I'm deciding a 510K is not required. But in this case, I think that the things may be adding up to where adding that new function would likely require a new submission. But of course, it depends on all the details, how you're marketing the product, what the intended use is. So there is flexibility in that. But yeah, thanks for that example, Reese. Yeah, and then lastly, of course, there's the other things to consider that we talked about, which may be an algorithm change if it's like doing something new to get that, but it may not. So just all of the things that you need to think about when making those decisions. So I do have a little quiz if we wanted to test your knowledge. I have the examples from the FDA guidance, but I don't want to jump to that if we have some other questions or examples to go through.
I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
I might be misreading the guidance here, but one of the items talks about if you do end up having to make it seems like you should submit a new 510K. It sounds like they're saying if you have changes that trigger the 510K, but you also have changes independent that would just follow the normal documentation path, you combine both in the new 510K. But then it said something interesting that they made it sound like you could make those changes immediately that are not the triggering changes.
Yeah.
So I was just curious. That sounds like it would get really confusing and messy. Does that happen in practice, or what does that look like?
Yeah, all the time, actually. You can go years with letters to file, and then one thing will trigger the 510K, but your documentation needs to be reflective of all the changes that have been made up to that point in time. It doesn't mean that you were like illegally marketing it during that time, but the FDA is interested in all of the changes that have added up to where the device is now that they're reviewing. So there may be some other things like George mentioned, there was maybe some other changes that had happened along the way in his example that probably should have triggered a new 510K that managed to slip under the radar for a long time. But yeah, even if all those changes are documentation only, wouldn't normally require a letter to file, everything has to be like described in detail in the new submission. That's a good question, because that does happen a lot. And a lot of times clients are surprised at how much effort it is, because it is a lot sometimes.
I think also, the special 510K, I'm not sure, how much everybody's aware of, but, most of the time we're preparing traditional 510Ks, and those are the ones that, take over 6 to 9 months. The FDA has special 510Ks that were made specifically for things like this. And so when you submit a special 510K, they have the highest priority with the FDA. A special 510K, the FDA has to drop what they are doing, okay, and focus on your special 510K, because they have only 30 days to make a decision. The FDA works very efficiently to internal clocks that they have to report to Congress. And so in 30 days, they either have to, allow the change or to give you a hold letter, okay? But what I found recently was that I had a situation with the client that we submitted a special 510K, it got put on hold, and we automatically assumed, oh, it's now a traditional. And we actually took a little time because we had to meet with the FDA. And then once we provided that additional information, the clock, which you could see on the customer collaboration portal, okay, started, and it started for another 30 days. So if you add it up, it's 60 days, not counting the time that it was on hold and we had to get the information. We were able to get the 510K cleared, a special that, they still had issues, and, we still beat the traditional. So sometimes that helps. The cost of a 510K gets enormous. Sometimes they don't have money for it, whether it's special or traditional, it's still the same price. So
Yeah, that's a good point though to bring up, George, because even if as you're doing this analysis, evaluating your changes, even if it does require 510K, if you're modifying your own device, it likely may be a special 510K. And so you're not looking at a traditional timeline of 90 days. You're not looking at all of the documentation that is normally required for a traditional 510K. It is a smaller scope of work. So I would definitely point you as further reading to the special 510K guidance document so that you can understand in what circumstances is that applicable, because that might impact your strategy as well. If you think, okay, well, I'm going to submit this, and then during the 90 days that they're reviewing this, I'm going to be working on developing the next version. And then as soon as it's cleared, I'm going to submit a special. And then you're really only delaying things like 30 days or however long the special review takes. But that might be something worth considering. So I would recommend you read that guidance as well.
I just wanted to add in a couple of comments about like George mentioned, the regulatory team often at many companies is the most conservative group. And that's a pretty common complaint I get on sales calls, is companies will come to us saying, we were working with this regulatory consultant and they're telling us we have to do new 510Ks for every change. And it just feels really burdensome. And, in general, like sometimes companies are just fishing around for like a yes person to just say yes to whatever they want to do. But I also do think there's some validity sometimes where regulatory people, maybe especially ones that have worked at very large companies and are used to an environment where the company's business goals are very risk averse, that they then translate that over into small companies who are maybe willing to be closer to the line or the blurriness in the regulations. Because when you read the regulation, like in the very first few pages of the guidance, like really all of this is just hinging on the word significant and like what does significant mean? And that's like the letter of the law. Like the guidance is all kind of extra clarity that the FDA gives on top, but like really it's like all
Yeah.
coming down to just expanding on what we think is significant or not in a whole bunch of specific situations. But you could always argue like, oh, I don't think this actually is significant. And I don't know.
Yeah, there's a whole psychology to letters of file. We could probably write a book. You know, the who are the stakeholders, and like you said, larger companies, their thought process or practices trickle down. And a lot of times in larger companies, they'll actually have FDA people that, you know, made the switch. And so, you know, the small companies will take the lead off of that too. But you are allowed to make changes, okay? Biggest thing is whether or not you can defend them, like Mary had mentioned. And the point of defense may happen 2 years from when that decision was made. And sometimes people move on. You know, this is another, you know, phenomenon where you're sitting across from the FDA defending someone else's decision, and you may not necessarily agreed with it. So once again, I always look at like you have to be rational and ask the questions. Another example was when, you know, I was involved in a situation where we asked whether or not it was a customer complaint. And so some people said yes, and some people said no. And it's like, why is it indecision? It was a customer expectation. In other words, they wish you put it in. Okay. It wasn't a complaint in the sense of the FDA definition. So, you know, you have to find out, what are we talking about, a complaint? And if it's a complaint, it has to be in your CAPRA system. And you know that the FDA is probably going to look at, you know, that file in particular with the letters of file. And then, you know, if it's a you know, expectation you didn't meet, okay, or, you know, an afterthought, that's a little bit different. So there's a whole psychology. You probably could make a lot of money writing a ebook on this, you know. And
Yeah, I think it's good to get different eyes on your letters to file as well and get different perspectives. It's something I often suggest companies take a good focus on when they're doing their internal audits, is have somebody else look at your letters to file that's maybe not familiar with them. And maybe they would identify different risks or different concerns that, you know, an FDA inspector coming in might see as well. So just a thought.
Yeah, just a thought on kind of all this. I think when there's more uncertainty about something, like what tends to happen is you become more conservative about that thing, right? So like, for example, if we have a statement of work that we're trying to give for one of our clients, it's for a software engineering project, and we have a large uncertainty, what happens? Then that estimate becomes probably higher, right? Than if we had more information, if we had more knowledge, if we could bring that gap down narrower. And I think it's a similar thing with kind of this like conversation here. Is I think what we have as a team that sets us apart is we can bring that certainty down because we have the engineering, because we also have the regulatory, and we also have some of the clinical side too. Is that whenever we come into a problem, we can bring down that certainty. Is this a note to file or not? Well, if you had a lot of uncertainty, you have a lot of fear, right? Then it becomes, oh yeah, this is a note to file. But if you know more about the device and you know more about why the FDA is asking these things, this also requires you to, you know, think one level ahead. Is like, put yourself in the shoe of the FDA. Why do they even have this note to file business in the first place? Right? It's because they don't want to see these changes that are like really insignificant. They would rather focus their efforts to protect the public on changes that actually matter. But you know, if you don't know that, then it's just a big unknown. Then you're just gonna be a lot more conservative than what you needed to be. So,
yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh no. I was just gonna say, I think it's a really great point, and like I think really highlights the value add of having the engineering and regulatory kind of working together. Is like it, because if the regulatory team doesn't like fully understand this, the engineering or how software is made or how AI models are trained or all these different things, yeah, like you said, like they're going to be more conservative because they don't understand that there's a lot more unknowns to them. But so
Yeah.
I'm sorry to jump in, you John. I thought you were, but
And yeah, that's actually a great point. Like that exact point has come up a couple of times, where we had clients come to us that that they didn't agree that just to retrain the algorithm would require like a special or a full 510K. But if you read the guidance by the letter, you could probably come down to that conclusion. But if you read the examples, and then if you put like an engineer's eye on those examples, you can understand what the FDA really meant by that, and that just a retrain is not, it's not necessary to resubmit a 510K just to retrain the algorithm. Even though if you read the letter, like there is a most conservative path with the uncertainty to go down the route that this is a 510K. When in practice it's not. And the only way to really deduce that is to, you know, bring together both sides and look at the problem together as a team and say, well, now knowing this, we have more confidence and we can decrease our error bar, and we can say with more confidence that we're going to go with the least burdensome approach.
And there is like a parallel safety path where you may decide that a letter to file is what's necessary, not a new submission. And so you can document that in your file and you can start marketing it. But you can be, if you want to do a catch-up 510K, if there is that variability or uncertainty, then you can submit that in parallel with your marketing decision. That is what a catch-up 510K is essentially. Is it didn't necessarily trigger a 510K, but we're doing one anyway because we just want to make sure that the FDA is still okay with the changes that we've made, even though we do not think it triggered a new submission. So I've seen that too, where companies will decide, oh, it's probably not needed, I'm just going to start marketing it, but just to be safe, I'm going to still submit a 510K. So
yeah. I think another thing too, if you think about it, right? If a client comes to us saying they're not sure, you know, the financial incentive is for us to say, hey, we'll do your 510K for you. In other words, it's kind of like reverse bias. And I think that to have a reputation in the marketplace, not that we're pushovers, but we're objective. And if the decision says that you could do a letter to file, well, you know, that shows you're objective and you're not financially driven, you know, and so I think that if you go to a lot of other regulatory consultants, you know, it's easier to say, hey, it's a special, I'm going to do it, you know, for those reasons. Why would I even get behind this? You know, because when I advise clients, I always say it's a risk. You have to sign it. We can, you know, recommend this or that. But at the end of the day, if the FDA comes to you and let's say, you know, either you didn't tell us everything, we didn't fully understand it, you own the problem. You just can't say, well, you know, InnoLitics said it or George said it or whatever, you know. So I think it's, once again, the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, how David was saying, people will have these types of disputes and they'll seek, you know, companies to get an expert opinion. And if, you know, if we say we can provide you with guidance, expert guidance on letters of file, you know, we're sort of almost like a lawyer where they can come with the most confidential information and, you know, we'll help them and then, you know, give them what they need as far as to make the right decision. So anyhow,
it's just it's one parallel that jumps out at me when you're talking, George, is like a doctor ordering an MRI, and it's like they get paid more and there's less risk for them. So like
yeah.
when it comes, you know, like I think a lot of doctors are trying to like balance things, and it's a known problem that like it's
Yeah.
too expensive, but it's still, the incentives are all pushing that way,
Yeah.
kind of the same.
It's the moral hazard, you know, right? That's what they call it, I think, the phenomenon.
Yeah, interesting point, yeah. All right, well, I think that brings us to time. Are there any final thoughts or final questions anybody had? You all got out of the quiz, congratulations.
Thanks for the great presentation, Mary. This is awesome.
Appreciate the participation.
Should put it on SlideShare.
Thanks everyone for joining,
Okay,
especially Pablo. I know it's late, so thank you.
thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank
It
you.
was great. See ya.